Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to another lesson. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you about modal verbs. Must, ought to, should, have to, ought not to, ought to, and a few more. Now, remember, this is the third lesson on modal verbs. I have already uploaded 2 more videos on modal verbs. Remember that modal verbs are also called auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs. Now, before we begin this lesson, if you find the lesson useful and informative, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with your friends and family or anybody else who may need it. Remember, sharing is caring. Now, let us begin. For you to be able to use modal verbs correctly in writing, for a test, or in your day-to-day life, it is important to know the rules. Rule number 1. Use must and have to indicate or to show a regulation, a legislation, or a requirement, a conclusion, or a necessity. So, use must and have to indicate a requirement. A requirement by law is called a regulation or a legislation. It is required by law that you do it. Let us look at the examples on the right. Example 1. You must stop at the traffic light. You must stop at the traffic light. Now, if you're driving a car and the traffic light turns red, then you must stop. That is a requirement by law. So when you want to indicate that something is a requirement legally, then you use must. You must stop at the traffic light. Look at the next example. I just knew she had to be your sister. I just knew she had to be your sister. Now, use must and have to indicate a conclusion. And a conclusion here means that you have arrived at that conclusion based on your observation. So when we say, I just knew she had to be your sister, maybe because you really look alike. Okay, you look so much alike. So from looking at you and looking at your sister, I concluded that you must be sisters. So in that case, you use had to be. I just knew she had to be your sister. Rule number 1C. Use must and have to indicate a necessity. A necessity means that something is necessary. Okay? Something is necessary. Look at the last example in number 1. He had to work overtime yesterday. He had to work overtime yesterday. So he had to. It was necessary. He had to do it. Okay? So, when you want to indicate or to suggest that something is a legal requirement, or when you conclude something after making an observation about something, or when you want to show that something is a necessity, then use must or have to. Let us move on to rule number 2. Use should and ought to suggest that something should have happened. You want to make it very clear that something should have happened. Use should and ought to. Okay, so you can use should or you can use ought to. Look at example 2. You should be ashamed of yourself, or you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Okay, so what you're suggesting here is the person should be really ashamed of themselves. Maybe they've done something ridiculous. Maybe they've done something that is really, that has caused you a lot of embarrassment. Maybe they've done something that is really horrible and nasty, and you kind of did not expect it from them, but they've done it anyway. So you can say to them, you should be ashamed of yourself, or you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Rule number 3, use should have or ought to have plus use should have. Okay, use should have or ought to plus have plus the third verb form to indicate that something should have happened, but it did not happen. So when you want to suggest that something should have happened, but it did not happen, then you should use should have or ought to. Okay? Plus have plus the third verb form. Remember, the third verb form is the past perfect tense. Okay? The past perfect tense. I have a video uploaded on the past perfect form of the verb. Okay? The past perfect tense. I have uploaded about that, and in my previous video about modal verbs, I have explained with some examples what the third form is. So feel free to look up those videos. Now, so you want to indicate that something should have happened, but it did not happen, then you use should have or ought to have. Now, let us look at example 3. You should have paid more attention. You should have paid more attention, or you ought to have paid more attention. You ought to have paid more attention. So what you mean here is the person should have actually paid more attention. Maybe they failed in their exams because they spent the whole of their year playing around, not doing their homework, not listening to the teachers. So after they fail their results, after they fail their exams and get really bad results, then their parents can say to them, you should have paid more attention. Okay, you ought to have paid more attention because it's something that should have happened, but it did not happen, and that's why they failed their exams. Rule number 4, use must have plus the third verb form to indicate a conclusion you have arrived at. So if you have arrived at a certain conclusion because you have seen how things have turned out, then you can use must have plus the third verb form, okay, to indicate that. Look at example 4. I can't find my English books. I must have left them at home. I can't find my English books. I must have left them at home. So in this case, you have been searching for your English books. You've been looking for your English books and you cannot find them. And you want to express that you have a feeling that you have left your books at home. So after thinking very deeply, you have arrived at the conclusion that you left your books at home. Then you can express that using must have plus the third verb form. Look at example 4. Once more, I can't find my English books. I must have left them at home. So, as we move on to the next rule, remember once more that for you to really be able to understand any grammar and to be able to use the language effectively, not just in speaking, in writing, or for exams, you really need to understand the rules. And once you do that, you can use those verb forms in whatever circumstances. Now, let us move on to rule number 5. Use cannot or can't or must not or mustn't to indicate that something is not allowed. So you want to let someone know that something is not allowed. You can use cannot, and the short form for cannot is can't, or you can use must not, and the short form for must not is mustn't. Mustn't. Okay? Look at the examples 5. You can't smoke here. It's not allowed. You can't smoke here. Like for example, if someone starts smoking in the plane, okay, they will be told, sorry sir, you can't smoke here because it's not allowed. Look at the next example. You mustn't tell your sister. You mustn't tell your sister. Or you can say, you mustn't smoke here. So use mustn't or can't to let someone know that something is not allowed. Okay? They are not allowed to do it. Rule number 6. Use don't have to or need to, or the short form of need to, which is needn't, okay, to indicate that something does not have to happen. It is not compulsory. You want to let someone know that, hey, you can choose to do it or not. You don't have to do it. It's not compulsory. It's not a must for you to do it. Okay? Then use don't have to or need to, which is needn't. Look at example 6. You don't have to believe me. Okay? You don't have to believe me. So in other words, you can choose to believe me or not. The choice is yours. You don't have to believe me. Okay? Or you can say, you don't need to believe me. You don't need to believe me. Or you can say, you needn't believe me. You needn't believe me. okay? You needn't believe me. So it's up to you. You can choose to believe me or you can choose not to. Okay? So when you want to suggest that, when you want to indicate to somebody that, look, it's your choice, it's not compulsory, then use don't have to or need to or needn't. Okay? And now let's look at the last rule, number 7. Use should not, or the short form, which is shouldn't, or ought not to indicate that something should not have taken place or happened. So if you want to let somebody know that something should not have happened or taken place, then use shouldn't or ought not to. Okay? Look at example 7. You shouldn't drink so much. You shouldn't drink so much. Or you can say, you ought not to drink so much. You ought not to drink so much. Okay? You shouldn't drink so much. You ought not to drink so much. All right? Now, this brings me to the end of this lesson. But before I end the lesson, I'm just going to remind you of really the key rules. If you want to indicate a legal requirement, that something is required by law, or that you have arrived at a certain conclusion, or that something is a necessity, use must and have to. If you want to suggest that something should have happened, then use should and ought to. If you want to suggest that something should have happened, but it did not happen, then use should have or ought to have plus the third verb form. If you want to indicate a conclusion that you have arrived at, use must have plus the third verb form. And if you want to let someone know that something is not allowed, then use can't or mustn't. And if you want to let your friend know that something does not have to happen, they don't have to do it, it's not compulsory, then use don't have to or needn't. And finally, when you want to let someone know that something should not have taken place or happened, that it should not have happened or taken place, then use shouldn't or ought not to. If you found this lesson useful and informative, please do me a favor, be kind, subscribe to the channel. That will encourage me to keep uploading more videos to help you improve your English even further. Also, do not forget to give this video a thumbs up and share the video with your friends, your family, your classmates, or anybody else who may need it. Thank you very much and see you in our next lesson. Bye bye and take really good care of yourself.